I'm Diana Garlough, and thank you all for coming out this evening. It's quite a challenge to get here, probably a little bit slippery. It should be the very top. Yep, in the chat. So the project that Bob and I are working on, it just kind of came together, just really one of those serendipity things. In the teacher education program, you know, one of the things we would be looking at would be just changing demographics. You just can't read much of anything that's education related without looking at even differences as far as student achievement, and even if you control for socioeconomic status, you'll see that students in different racial groups just have different rates of success, or they have different achievement rates. So I kept thinking, you know, there's a reason for that. If you don't believe that people are inherently have more or less academic ability according to race, you know that there have to be some underlying factors. So just began to dig into what did I think those were, or what could I find out that some of those things were. And in doing that kind of study, I found one of the things I found is that 83% or so of U.S. school teachers are of the dominant culture. So they're white, they're middle class, they're European American descent, and they speak only one language. And in contrast, students in the public schools are growing more and more diverse in all of those diversity markers, and even more. All right, so then you have to ask yourself, is there a so what? So with as many as 21% of school-age children who speak a first language other than English, and about another 21% of children that live in families with income that are below the federal poverty level, and 42% who live in low-income homes, you know, then there's just a difference between the way those students are being raised, or their experiences, and a lot of their teachers. Students of color make up more than 45% of the pre-K-12 population, according to the 2012 U.S. Census data. By 2050, there will be no racial or ethnic group that will constitute a true majority. So you can say, so what? If teachers are doing a good job of teaching, how does race matter? How does socioeconomic status matter? How does culture matter? You know, why is that a big deal? Well, there really are differences, not only personality-wise, person to person, but also there seem to be different racial and cultural differences in areas such as communications. Just in asking questions, dominant culture people tend to ask, at least for early childhood, they ask a lot of questions that are teacher questions they know the answer to. In some cultures, those are silly questions, and so students don't necessarily engage in answering them, and it might look like they're just tuning out in the classroom. How authoritarian or non-authoritarian? Dominant culture teachers, especially early childhood, tend to invite their students to come forward and invite them to line up. Well, in some cultures, that just doesn't make sense. The adults don't do that. They tell you, maybe kindly, you know, this is what you need to do. All right, so we know that there are cultural mismatches. Do you think a classroom where students are really learning a lot, do you picture one that's really loud and active, or do you picture one where students are sitting quietly and maybe more passive? All right, so there are cultural expectations there. Thinking about how competitively classrooms are set up. Are students working individually? Are they working collaboratively? So there are cultural differences there and expectations. How a child shows respect, especially if they're in trouble. You know, many dominant culture teachers will tell their student, you look me in the eye when I'm talking to you. For a lot of cultures, that's a sign of disrespect to an authority figure. So if teachers don't know that, and the students don't know that, you know, we've set ourselves up for a lot of miscommunication and probably some of those achievement gap issues. So as I started thinking about that, in our department, we started really looking at how can we address those in this geographic area, in the areas that we send our students to do a lot of their field work and in what they study and what's in their curriculum. You know, how can we start addressing some of those issues? So when we started looking and understanding cultural and racial expectations and why it's hard very many times for white people to understand how race impacts them and culture, because our culture is everywhere and it's self-reinforcing. A couple of books that have been really prominent in helping me understand my racial identity. This is an old edition now, there's a newer one, but it's called We Can't Teach What We Don't Know, White Teachers in Multiracial Schools, and it's by Gary Howard. And he's a white educator. He chronicles his understanding of living a life of privilege, going to Yale, and then having this experience one summer with students who were part of a YMCA program who were not of the dominant culture. He ended up living in that particular neighborhood by choice for several years and talking about how he really grew to understand what he didn't know, and then how he could help other white people understand cultural and racial differences. So he was one major influence. And then another one by an African-American educator is Start Where You Are But Don't Stay There. And it's talking again about trying to understand what we don't already know and how we further that. So our department, our faculty do book studies that are based around racial and cultural understandings. That's what we're studying right now and have been for a couple of years. And in part of that, we've decided that we really need to make sure that we understand our own racial identities. It's not enough to help our students understand the impacts of race and culture in schools. So part of that happened when I took a class, Social Stratification, with Bob one summer. So do you want to talk about that? Or?
Sure. Yeah.
We don't have this like really down pat.
No, I think the really important thing to kind of focus on this, and I think what you'll see as Diana kind of gets into the nuts and bolts here, is as we're trying to educate our teacher candidates, our student teachers, to be good teachers and be able to integrate into different communities and connect with their students. You have a hard time doing that if you haven't figured out the issues that you have just through socialization, just through the community that you were raised in and the demographic information that has affected you directly. We could encourage our teachers, our teacher candidates, to say, hey, go get some books that have diversity in them, that come from different cultures or different races or different classes, and teach those to your kids. But if you don't really understand the impact of what the story is about, if you don't know what that might mean to, say, an immigrant student when you're giving them a book about immigrants leaving their country and moving to a new place, you teach it on a surface level that you really don't understand where you're at. So the job that our education department has that becomes kind of a challenging task is to be able to get the students to recognize where they start and to get them some exposure to other cultures so that they're just not teaching on a surface level or a stereotypic level, but they understand where they're coming from. And they can't just sympathize with these students, they can empathize with them. They can really understand what they're going through, and the communication is real, and it's not going to be inauthentic. They're going to be able to make these connections. But they can't do that if they never get past some of the surface level. And I think, as Diana was pointing out, our faculty can't do that unless they get past a lot of these issues as well. So it's quite an undertaking for her department as a unit to start to undertake a lot of these issues, and that's kind of where she ended up with Penny Gibson, who's also one of our students here and coordinator for her in my stratification class, which just studies inequalities across society and their sources. And I think a lot of it lined up very nicely with the Howard book and a lot of the themes in the Howard book. And we started kind of talking about collaborating on this project to see where some of the more sociological ideas and concepts could line up with some of the stuff that Howard was talking about in a very applied way. So I'll hand back now to talk about Howard.
You want to advance? Oh, here we go. All right, so, when Bob was teaching this class on social stratification and we talked about oppression and just, I guess that was one of the dominant themes, I kept thinking, I know a children's book that goes with that. I know a picture book for this and that and the other thing. And I said, to Bob, do you realize that is out there? And so I brought in this big stack of books and we started talking about, is there something we could do as a joint effort to make sure that, really the kinds of things that I was thinking about doing were correct, I guess, from a sociological conceptual basis, and then how can we make some of those things accessible for our students, because we have a number of diversity kinds of elements in our program. We're trying to infuse it into the curriculum. We have something called the urban experience where students go to Nashville for a week, and that's really not the basis of what we're talking about, but I could talk about that for a long time. So what we try to do to make one more point that would be really accessible for students is from the chapter where Howard talks about, you know, how he really began to, in his journey to go from just thinking about, I need to understand myself racially, I need to help others understand themselves racially, and how do I do that? And what he says is there's a fourfold process, and we developed this into a discussion guide that can be applied to all different kinds of literature. And in the first part is honesty. So what can I do as a white teacher? And you know, like Bob said, we need to get past the surface level understandings if we're going to teach different literature. So for example, I'm going to not be very cool here, but in this book, Encounter, this was the first one that I really started thinking about. This is probably a different story of Christopher Columbus than many of you might have experienced when you were in school, and that's what my early and middle childhood students tell me. This is told from the standpoint of the Taino native child whose village Christopher Columbus and, you know, the people on the ship where they land, and then are the end effects. And it's certainly not the discovery journey that you might have been exposed to when you were growing up, or what was popular when I was growing up. So honesty would say, you know, we need to take a really critical look at what is going on and examine our assumptions of rightness and really start to dig into where we have ignorance as white people. I'm not saying that's the way you're going to teach it to your young children, and most of these picture books, even if they are appropriate at one level for early childhood, they're probably middle childhood and high school is where you would actually use them with students. Or, you know, it could be librarians and it can be caregivers and so on. But we're looking at what truly are we talking about here? Where is oppression, or where is there something that we might have just glossed over before, read the story and not really done much with that. So we talk about questions that you can ask to help students understand that honest perspective. And then we go, you know, as Bob said, into empathy. Empathy allows you to really take the standpoint of someone else and say, how would that feel to me? And then what would I do with it? And especially for people who are of the dominant culture who may not have understood those impacts. You know, we still live in a very segregated society. And so, you know, we don't always understand. Going into advocacy, you know, allowing people who are not necessarily involved in circles of power into that conversation place. Now maybe what we're doing right now, you know, with these books is really allowing that mostly through the literature and allowing those characters to speak. But certainly children of color, if there is some way, or socioeconomically, if there is some way that they are identifying with characters in the book, that's allowing them a voice. It's legitimizing maybe what their experience is and maybe not a dominant culture experience. All right, and maybe even leading into action. There are a number, I brought a few books, but there are a number of books that are written that really emphasize this is a really high quality story. This will allow you to get into the life of someone else, but they also give you resources in the back if you want to know more about educating females in certain countries, or if you want to know more about refugee relief, or, you know, just so even children's literature, very well developed literature, is going to allow you to help your students understand how advocacy works and putting into action some of the things they're learning. So we created this protocol. I've used it in a class, and I've got some students who are doing a research project, and they're going to take this protocol into a class as well. And I think it would be a good thing now to have Bob talk about like how we've tied this in.
This is a little off topic, but kind of lines up nicely with what Diana was saying. Having been involved in kind of their vision, the education vision of these topics, and then obviously the way sociologists would present it, it's been kind of eye-opening. I'll give you a very real example from 9 o'clock this morning. I'm going through my Facebook feed, and I see a little video about an Iraqi family who's a refugee family, and I'm like, oh, okay, and I start watching it, and they said, and the mom wouldn't leave without her cat. And I went, oh, I never even thought about cats. You know, if you're suddenly forced to flee, you're not only leaving family and friends and connections behind, but you're leaving your goods and your items, and can you take your pets and things like that. And by the time I got to the video, the room got very dusty, and I was, you know, my eyes were tearing up because of all the dust in the room and stuff. But it's just things like that you probably don't think about when you hear refugee or you hear immigrant or something like that, that this is something that you're leaving everything behind. And trying to get students to kind of see that connection to that whole thing is very important for our teacher candidates to make that connection. The other thing that I think is kind of important is, Diana's talking a lot about the terminology that we use in sociology, things like privilege and oppression, which tend to make people get defensive pretty quickly. What do you mean I have privilege, I don't have privilege? Or what do you mean I'm oppressing people, I like people, why would I oppress them? Those are more structural discussions. Are you in a category that has a natural advantage, where people are simply going to trust you because you are fill in the blank? Or are you in a different category on the different side of the equation, where there may be distrust, simply because they see you and go, geez, I don't know much about those people except what I saw on the news. And then you have these types of barriers that are already there that we have to get past with our teacher candidates to even start to have this discussion. And one of the things, as Diana was discussing this with me and we were reading these books, two concepts that kind of came up, they're very related to one another, are concepts from a feminist named Patricia Hill Collins, who is still alive, still working in sociology, talked about having to recognize the difference between what she's calling knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is the common accepted scientific basis for knowing about something. We're in the basement of the library. There's lots of knowledge here. That there's the published books, the stuff that we've done scientifically, the things that we've raised hypotheses and then tested those hypotheses. That's the knowledge stuff. That anybody can read about inequality, anybody can read about race, anybody can read about trans issues and get that knowledge. But the wisdom is what you get from living it, from being in a group that has that disadvantage, or those disadvantages if they pile up on you, and starting to recognize how much of an impact those have on your life. Now, one of the questions I always ask, as I see many of my students here, you've heard this question before. If you're talking about this idea of wisdom and you're somebody like me, I check just about every privilege box you get. I'm white, I'm male, I'm educated, I'm upper middle class, I'm married, I'm fairly well off, I'm Christian, all these things, I get lots of advantages. Can I get any of this information from these kids? And the answer is yes. You listen to their stories and you treat them like they're truth. So if we've got students who are being raised in Northwest Ohio in small towns, might not be running into a lot of diversity, might not be running into a lot of different stories and different experiences. Even based on class or something like that, you might not get that much diversity. But if we can expose them to these stories, through these books, if we can teach them to think about these things and expose their students once they get into the schools to these stories, then we open up these doors. We essentially can get them knowledge through educating them through picture books in a lot of these situations. So that brings the diversity into the classroom very directly, but also has them interact with it in such a way that they can very easily bring it along to their students. And kind of the quote I have up here from Hill Collins, knowledge without wisdom is adequate for the powerful, but wisdom is essential to the survival of the subordinate. Most of us can arrange our lives where we don't have to run into people who are all that different from us. People who are in the subordinate classes based on race, based on gender, based on class, based on age, sexuality, whatever we're talking about, probably don't have that luxury. So they have to learn to speak the language of their group and their culture and their norms and their values, but they also have to learn what we want and what we expect in the dominant group. What we're hoping to have our teacher candidates do is have the ability to connect that knowledge and that wisdom for the students so that they can reach them much more effectively.
I'm not sure where we go from here. Okay. We can show the website. I can pull that up if you. Oh, what do you want to?
I think it's going to be here it is. Go ahead and talk about it.
Okay, so we have developed a website, and with the, of course, communications and marketing, it helped us. And so what we've done is to try to decide, so what books would we put on the site, where there are just so many high-quality children's literature. So rather than us choosing books that we think are really good books, we've gone to the different societies. So the Coretta Scott King Award for African American books, the Native American Book Award, and so on. You can see the Asian Pacific American Librarians Association Award, and so on. So these are, these are people who are of those particular races and cultures that are saying these are high-quality books. So there are the award winners. We went from the most recent years, and we're hopefully trying to work our way back. Now, I will say the website, we plan for it to always be under construction. We plan to always be adding more books. So even what we have there in the shell is not completely finished, but the Coretta Scott King is probably a little further along than the others. I didn't even remember that page was on there.
Oh, that's all books.
Okay, yeah, so if you go to Coretta Scott King, I think that went to Middle East. So you can see, for example, the book Firebird, which is a Misty Copeland story. She's a ballerina, if you don't know. When she's African American, and when she started her dream of dancing, she really didn't see role models who looked like her, or not very many. And so she encourages another young dancer in the story. It's just very beautifully illustrated. It's very vivid. That's similar to a lot of the costumes that she wore when she danced. And so what we have here is the protocol, and then actually it's the site right now is a little clunky. We need to do some more work on it, but if you click on Firebird, it gives you even a little bit more information. It kind of looks like this is the whole thing. So we have reviewed a number of books. We've opened the reviewing and have asked like the local librarians. Our students are doing book reviews, and really, anyone who observes the site who would like to use it, you're certainly welcome to do a book review. I sent out a protocol to some people and have opened that up to them. So we would take questions at this time. Unless you had something else, Bob?
No, I just, we also have a glossary on here for people who, for those who might not be familiar with some of the terminology that's there, we've created a glossary just so you have access to that information as well. Questions? Ask something or we're going to send you back to the snow. Yeah.
How do you expect your future teachers, students to respond to this new way of teaching? I mean, you're bringing in this new thinking to your own students. How do you expect them as future educators to kind of encourage this new dynamic in the classroom?
Our students are very fortunate to have as their foundational education.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. So the question was, how do I expect our students to really respond to this, since it seems to be a new, I'm sorry, I don't remember what word you used.
It's a new dynamic.
So it's a new dynamic in the classroom. So really thinking about race and bringing to the forefront. It really is a lot of times hard for white people to talk about race, so teaching about race could be, even more difficult. So our students are very fortunate to start out with a class called Culture and Schooling, and they learn, I really wish I could put our two students that I see on the spot and say, come up here and talk about culture and schooling, but I won't do that. So they really learn from someone who is an expert in educational foundations, as far as just a lot of the topics that I already talked about: communication, specific issues for different cultural groups, why are we a segregated society, how that impacts where libraries are, how that impacts schooling, and so on. So they have that really, really good foundation to begin with. And then if Caitlin and Dean would nod if you agree, do you get a lot, so yes, so that is true. And then do you get a lot of diversity experiences throughout the program, whether it's in the curriculum, and yeah, so it's really woven throughout. So more new probably for the faculty than the students. But thanks, it's a good question. So
I think the other thing that kind of goes along with that is there's almost a real applied, almost dollars and cents approach to this, that the students are going out into a diverse environment. If they're not ready for that, they're not going to do well at that first job. They're not going to feel comfortable in their own classrooms. That's a recipe for disaster. And we feel like we're under-preparing them for that if we don't get them this information. So it's really just recognizing the changing demographics and trying to make sure we've got our candidates the skill sets to succeed right off the bat.
And our students do well over 100 hours of field experience prior to student teaching, and we try to have them in as much diversity as they can. So Culture and Schooling, they're in Lima. There's a couple of different placements that we use. We use Lima for a couple of other classes that are at higher levels too. So we try to expose them to as much diversity as we can. Thanks. I know Dean Repke, I think you had your...
I just wondered how someone knows where to access the website. Is that on the OU website?
This is linked on the education department, and it's also linked on sociology department, I believe. And you're supposed to be able to Google it. I've tried it, but I mean, I don't know the right search terms apparently. So, and it's probably not a real hot one, so it hasn't like come to the top. But thanks for asking.
While we're talking about that, all of those awards are searchable in the library catalog as subject headings. So if you have an award you want to look for, feel free, and you can see all the books that we have for that award.
This summer I made multiple trips to the library with stacks and stacks of books, and the librarians here are very happy to help you, and they will discuss the books with you because a lot of them they've read themselves, so it's a good time.
They're on the shelves if we haven't stolen them.
Yes,
Review them, yeah.
and I bought a bunch since then, but they order all of the award winners too on a regular cycle, so they should have pretty much anything you're looking for if you go and find that it's an award winner. Okay, looks like we're wrapped up.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Well, thank you for speaking. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to put in a quick plug for the next round. March 14th will be at 2 p.m. this time. We're going to have 3 speakers, so they're going to go really quick, back to back, so that we can get out of here in an hour. We're going to have 2 speakers from pharmacy, and Reverend McDonald is going to be here with the Canvas Labyrinth. We're going to have it set up here in the library so you can check it out after he talks about it. So it should be a good time. So thank you.